Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate Public Sector Group event of 2023. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Rachel Mitchell, our speaker, to take us through the next hour, but just a few items of housekeeping before we start. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elizabeth Barber and I chair IRMS Public Sector. We'd encourage people to use the chat to have discussions and to ask questions, but please can you keep the chat constructive and healthy. I'm sure that I don't need to say that to people, but we like to make expectations clear. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them as we work through the session. If you can put them in the questions tab, if not, put them in the chat. There will be some interaction that will go on later on in the session, so I hope everyone will be able to see that. I have spoken with Rachel, and both the recording and the slides will be available after the event. So without any more from me, I'm going to hand over to Rachel Mitchell from Leadership Through Data, who's going to take us through the next hour. So over to you, Rachel.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the webinar. I am a MS Teams girl, says it in the title. So we've been having fun trying to work with this platform. So hopefully everything works fine. We're going to be talking about Microsoft Teams and some of the best kept secrets. But first of all, I'd just like to introduce myself for those that haven't met me before. So I do have two hats. So the public sector is very close to my heart. I've been in it since the age of 21, through all sorts of occupations, starting in science and ending up in information governance, like we all do, had a very mixed journey. I am a person with two hats at the moment. I am a data protection officer and an information governance lead for the Care Inspectorate, who are the regulator for care services in Scotland. Everything is different in Scotland, as you will be aware. So that is a bit of a challenge for a girl that was based in England for a long, long time. So I do that on a part-time basis, and I'm also a consultant. And one of the places that I consult with is with Leadership Through Data. And I work with them on information governance and Microsoft 365 projects and training in the UK and overseas. So as I am here on behalf of LTD, I'm just going to explain how LTD work, because we like to make sure that we provide a bit of a gateway to transformative learning. So we're based in the UK, Australasia and North America, and we're all about good presentation. So we won't put lots of slides up with lots of words on, because that's not how we like to work. We like to make sure that you remember things through imagery, and we have lots of hands-on experience in our training, so it's as interactive and memorable as possible. So that's one thing we will offer you if you do come on any of our courses or our experiences. Okay, we've got webinars, courses and all sorts that you can get involved with. But I do want you to get involved with me, and I would like you to do a little poll. And this is going to launch now for you. And apologies, this slide formatting is a little odd because we've done the polls a different way on this platform. So there should be a poll that's launched for you by Elizabeth, my wonderful assistant, and there should be 4 questions. So once you see the poll launched, hopefully you can answer those questions for me. Elizabeth, you able to launch that for me? I'm not seeing anything in my polls at the moment.
No, I can't. I'm just trying to get it to launch. Oh, here we go. There we go. Publish poll. So, do you want me to publish all 4 at the same time?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'll be good at this by the time I've published all 4.
Yeah, we've both been deserted today, so we are working very well together, I think. Perfect. So the poll's now up. So what I would like you to do is, while I start to introduce the topics, I would like you to answer those questions for me, because I'm going to come back to those as part of my presentation. Okay, So please start answering those, and that would be amazing. So on our little journey about Microsoft Teams, lots of us have been in different places with our journey with Microsoft 365, and particularly where we've been from the space from COVID. So a lot of people threw out Microsoft Teams because they hadn't planned a Microsoft 365 migration before COVID hit us. And with the pandemic, of course, became home working. So we were really critical that we started to get all our ducks in a row in the way that we were going to work collaboratively as an organisation. So we kind of refer to this as the COVID method, and it wasn't ideal, but you know what? We had to just make the best of what we had at that particular time, didn't we? We were faced with unprecedented scenarios, and we needed to be able to communicate and work remotely, and we kind of switched on Teams and just kind of hoped for the best. Some people were in a good space. We were very lucky in the Care Inspectorate. We literally just finished rolling out Microsoft 365, including Teams, in the January. So there had been a coordinated approach. We were going to go back round and do all the governance, which we're still planning. But what we need to now do, a lot of us, is almost back record convert how we did that Teams rollout in the first instance. And in this webinar, we're going to have a look at the fact that actually the time is now. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter where you've been with Microsoft Teams or M365. What we need to make sure is that we're now thinking about how we actually want our teams to work, how we want the information governance to work around Teams, and actually think about now planning off the box and then applying it to the box. And when I'm doing training courses, if I say that once, I say it about 27 times. I always say to people, we need to think about what we want to implement before we start playing in the system. And I think with the COVID approach, we tended to just throw everything out and just launch it in the system without really thinking about some of the consequences, understandably. So we're going to talk about how we create, use and manage team sites. We're going to talk about whether you're getting the best experience for your users. And we're also going to talk about whether we're satisfying our information governance needs. One of the biggest for me is delegating accountability. We need to make sure that we're reducing the resources from the central teams like information governance, data protection, records management, and IT colleagues, because we don't work in the same way that we used to. And I think there still is that approach where we're trying to apply hard copy traditional methods to a very different system and digital data that's very different to manage. And I don't think we can. So we do need to make some really hard sort of decisions and judgments as part of that information governance. So what I want to talk about first is a bit about how Microsoft 365 is governed, so how the architecture works, because until we understand that, then I don't think we really understand how Teams fits in. Now, I'm going to make no apologies. I am starting from basic principles. So there might be some people on this call that think, I know all this. That's fine. But I wanted to start from basic principles because I think there's also a bit of an acceptance or an assumption, and we know what happens if we assume, that people have a baseline knowledge that they don't necessarily have in this space. And I've seen that a lot when I've worked as a consultant with organisations. And we expect that level of knowledge or assume that level of knowledge when it's not there. So I'm going back to first principles today. And as we've said, I'm really happy to take questions as I go along. So for me, I'm a diagrams girl, which can be a bit difficult as a data protection officer because I have to read a lot of hefty documents that don't have pretty diagrams in. But I'm a diagrams girl. So I've created this diagram as part of our kind of training. And it's to talk about the layers of the technical architecture that are in Microsoft 365. So we have the cloud. And the cloud just means that it's hosted by somebody else. There's nothing fancy in that terminology. It does feel quite ethereal, doesn't it, that we've put data in a cloud, but it literally just means that we've got data that's hosted by somebody else. And then within that cloud, you will have your organizational you will have your Microsoft Azure platform. So that's the platform that we sit our tenancy on and all of our applications in our tenancy space. So the second layer, if you like, is the Azure platform, and that can host other things as well. It doesn't just have to host M365. You might be using it in your organization for all sorts of different capabilities and applications. So when we start to then go back up the layers, these are the back-end information architecture. Sorry, Elizabeth, did you want to just come in on them?
Yes, we've just had someone ask in the chat whether it would be possible to make the slides larger. Then it's at the moment it's a tiny little image in one corner. I've just managed to make mine larger by using the two arrows on the top right hand corner of the image.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. That's we did practice a bit before, but let me, I think I've got mine as large as it will go in display.
Okay, so
picture in picture? No.
I've just managed to do it myself. So there's also people are saying it is larger, so that's better. Perfect. Thank you very much, Rachel.
No problem. Sorry, guys. I'm just not very good with this platform. So hopefully you can see that now. So we've got the layers. So on top of the Azure platform, the first kind of layer, if you like, in terms of the technical architecture are all the admin centers. So we have things like the Microsoft Entra Administration Center. Now, Microsoft likes to change the names of everything, which often confuses us immensely, but they do seem to do it quite often. So we have platforms such as the admin centers at the bottom of our sort of layers, if you like. And Entra used to be the old Active Directory. So that's the new name for the Active Directory. So Microsoft Entra ID is the old Active Directory. But in here, the most important one for us from an information governance and data protection and information security perspective is the Microsoft Purview Compliance Center. Now, if as information governance people, you have Microsoft 365 rolled out and you do not have permissions to Microsoft Purview, something's not quite right, because that's where most of the tools are that you will need to do your good information governance, okay? So top tip number one, you need to speak to your IT and get a little tour of the Purview and how it's set up, who has access, and get access if you haven't already. Because in that space, we have things like audit, e-discovery, so being able to search across the platform, data lifecycle management, and information protection. So all those good things that we want to do from an information governance perspective. So through our first level, which are all the admin centers, and there are a lot of them, so I'm not going to go into them all today because we're here to talk about teams. We then get into application-specific admin centers. So the next level up, we have a Teams administration center, we have a SharePoint administration center, and we have Exchange. Now, within each of these, you can configure how you want the applications to behave within your organization. So again, if you have a key role in setting policy for information governance or any of its associated information security, etc., you need to have access to these areas, or at least understand how they've been set up for your organization now. And it might be that IT have done that if you've done this kind of panic rollout, but actually you need to think about how they're configured going forward. Yeah, because that's where all the governance, the specific governance for each application can be tweaked, if you like. And then finally, we have the applications themselves. And you know, in Microsoft 365, if you've already got the system, there are lots of applications. And we're going to be talking about Teams today. So really, we're interested in the fact that we've got the Teams application and we've got the Teams admin center. So I hope everybody's just understood that little... sorry, I was just checking the chat. Everybody's good. It was all about the display. Perfect. So that's the layers. So then when we go from the layers and the thinking about how we are rolling out that whole tenancy, and by the way, this organizational tenancy level is what you would log into. So it's basically your email address and your personal login under your license for Microsoft 365. So if I was in my Leadership Through Data tenancy, it would be rachel@leadershipthroughdata.co.uk that I would log in on, and that would take me into the organizational space within this secure organizational boundary. Yeah. So we need to think about security and protection at all of these levels. And that's where it can start to become quite complex. So what will your organization use Teams for? You know already that there's a lot of capability that goes on in that space. And that's why with Microsoft, with all the applications, it becomes quite confusing about actually how are we setting our policies in relation to what should we use Teams for, and how we want Teams to be used in our organization. So you can go from group chat to video call. You can securely connect with people internationally. You can share files and collaborate in real time in Teams. You can stay organized with your calendars, with notes. You've got notebooks potentially. You've got applications that you can link to your team space. It's a lot to think about from a governance perspective. So let's just have a little think about the answers in Slido. We're not using Slido, in the poll. Elizabeth, I have a feeling that I can't see the poll responses. So could you possibly let me know what the answers are to question 1? Elizabeth? Seamless, everybody, this is seamless.
Yeah, it would help if I unmuted, wouldn't it? So the first answer was 54%, so 33.
Okay, meetings only. Yep.
No, sorry. All meetings only, which I've got at the bottom, I beg your pardon, is 2%.
Okay.
Meetings, chat, team sites for functions and projects is 20%. And 12 answers. All features, meetings, chat, team sites for functions and projects, and SharePoint sites for records, not file tab in Teams, is 24%, 15 people. And the top answer is all features, meetings, chat, team sites for functions, projects, and team, SharePoint sites for records is 35, which is 55%.
So sorry, can I just clarify? So the top one was standalone SharePoint sites not using the SharePoint file tab?
No. Oh, hang on.
Other way around.
Other way around.
Perfect. Thank you. So that's a really interesting stat, because when we first went into the team space and we had this pesky thing that was created with Teams, which information governance people seem to hate, which was the file tab, which was effectively a SharePoint site. We were kind of told at the time, and I'm talking 5-6 years ago, that space wasn't very good from a records management perspective. And many of the organizations that rolled out at that point were actually creating separate SharePoint sites and linking them to the team space. Thankfully, the world has moved on, because we can use that SharePoint space, and we can have all of our content in our Teams associated SharePoint, which makes governance a lot easier, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail when we get further into the slides. So thank you for completing that little poll. Interestingly, some people are still using it for meetings only as well, which is really interesting, that we're still in that space where people are trying to think about maybe how they're going to sort of roll out the rest of Microsoft 365. Okay, so rather than thinking about what our organization will or wants to use Teams for, we in information governance need to write policy and procedure to say, this is what you should be using Teams for. So what should you be using chat for example? Ephemera, so nothing that really is core business. Use channels for core business records, for example. So it's up to us to set our stall there about what people should and shouldn't do, so that actually we can hold people to account through audit to say, actually, you're not complying with policy. And if we haven't got into that space yet, that's kind of our first stepping stone. So think about what our policy should be. Now, if it was small before, guys, this next slide is going to be a bit of a nightmare for you all, but please bear with me because it's a really important one. The architecture that Microsoft have designed for us within Microsoft 365 is really important to understand, because if we try to decide, well, I want to do this with Teams, or I want to do this with SharePoint, or I want to have a user profile within a person space or an individual space that's doing X, if it's not going to work with the architecture as it's designed, we are fighting a losing battle. So one of the things I absolutely love is this modern collaboration slide by Microsoft. Now, I know it's busy, and I know at first sight it's a bit of a nightmare if you haven't seen it before. I will share the link with the slide deck as well so that people can access it. So effectively, this shows us how Microsoft envisage that we work in a day-to-day basis. Okay, so me as a person, I will do things in relation to creating content, in relation to having conversations with people. I might be chatting with people in Teams on a one-to-one basis, but only ephemeral chatting, because I've set that policy to say things like, are you going for lunch? Not a conversation about how difficult a project is or something, or what the project deliverables are going to be. But in this space, Microsoft has shown us what applications they think we use when we're in our individual persona. And here's the individual and here's the person. Now, we very often work as part of a team. And that's what we're talking about today, isn't it? That Teams application. Now, if you look here as working as part of a team, you can see the purple blobs of Teams are all over that space. Hopefully you can see. The purple blobs of Teams are all over that space. So they're expecting us to use Teams in team collaboration, does exactly what it says on the tin. But we're not just a member of a team, we're a member of an organization. I'm not going to go into that space more today, but actually from an organizational perspective, Yammer, or Microsoft Engage as it's now called, is all over that space. So if you're not using Microsoft Engage and Microsoft is expecting you to use that in the community and organization space, there's a couple of question marks there, isn't there, about how the architecture is going to work for you. I'm not advocating the use of Microsoft Engage or Yammer. It's an organizational choice, but we just need to, the point is we need to be cognizant of how Microsoft think we're using this stuff. And obviously we've done a lot of work in the, I'm saying we, the royal we, a lot of work's been done in the IRMS CAB with Microsoft to actually really improve from an information governance perspective everything that's happening in this kind of space, in this modern collaborative architecture. So please have a look at this slide in slower time. Please use it for, sorry, I just clicked on that and now I'm going to lose it. Sorry, guys. Please use it to think about how your organization works. It's really good to add your own personas to this. So you could have a persona that's a finance person. You could have a persona that's an information governance person. You could have a persona that's a project manager, and think about what applications and what aspects of the architecture they might use, for example. So really helpful slide, I think, although it is very, very busy. So let's get back to what we were talking about. Let's get back to Microsoft Teams themselves, which is a pivotal cog in our team collaboration working. The nomenclature really isn't helpful, is it? So the Teams application is the purple bit, and the team are the people that are going to use it. So Microsoft Teams is a workspace for real-time collaboration and communication, for meetings, for file and app sharing, and even the occasional emoji. Don't stop people using emojis. Let's have a filter on them for any naughties, but I think that keeps the day job going. Have you lost sound? Oh, has somebody lost sound? I'm seeing in the chat. Can everybody else hear me? Oh, great. Thanks, Stephen. Good. So thinking about teams, I want to look at our second answer from the Slido, and I think Elizabeth has kindly popped them all in the chat for me. So let me just go back up. Oh, I can't see them, Elizabeth. I think it's cut them off because there's too many questions and comments.
Okay.
Elizabeth, question 2.
Question 2. Okay, so which features of Teams concerns you most with regard to governing Microsoft Teams? Select 2. So information retention, 48.
Yep.
Uncontrolled creations of Teams, 32.
Yep.
Working with external people and organisations, 22.
Yep.
And meeting security, 7.
Perfect. So understandably, with the audience that we've got here today, information retention is the biggest concern. I think some of the things we're going to talk about today around how we can use the different governance tools in groups, teams, and SharePoint as that collaboration, if you like, will help with information retention. But ultimately, it's all about simplification. We cannot try and do the kind of granular retention policies that we would like to do from our traditional business classification scheme into our retention schedule and then apply that to the system. We need to really simplify it. And I always think it's about risk and resource. So if you've currently got no retention whatsoever in the Microsoft 365 environment, and there are lots of people that haven't yet, because they've done this kind of COVID rollout, then actually, if we get some retention in at this point, it's better than we've got at the moment. Yeah. So don't be too hard on yourselves. Make a plan that's iterative, because at least then you can show that you're starting to reduce the risk. If you try and attack everything in one hit, it's going to be overwhelming and you're not going to have the resources to do it. And the organization is going to be overwhelmed too if we're going to have reviews as part of retention. So we really need to think about how we're going to do this in an iterative process. Now, from a Teams perspective, we can think about Teams as almost a Lego brick. So the Teams site at the moment is our first basic Lego brick, if you like. That allows us to start to inform our information security and our governance boundary. So for all the things like data loss prevention, sensitivity classification, retention, we can start to think of it at that Teams Lego brick boundary. And if we start to do that and keep the level at which we're going to apply the governance as high as possible, then we're getting a much more simplified model, which will be easier to deploy and also easier for us to actually maintain. Because remember, the more complex your governance becomes, the more difficult it is to retain. So start simple and then get more complicated as you get to understand the system and also how people are using it. So we need to think about then is the MOCA model, so the modern collaborative architecture, and how we want people to use the system, and then what governance we want to apply at that Teams Lego brick site. Okay, and at the Teams template level, we can start to identify, and somebody's mentioned uncontrolled creation of teams. We can start to think about what kind of Teams templates we have in our organization. So we may have projects that we're doing. We'll have functional areas. So from your business classification scheme, that nice top level. So things like finance, HR, records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You'll have functional areas depending on what your organization does. So we'll have functional teams that are core business teams. We'll have project teams that are transient, that will only last for a specific period of time. And we may have other types of teams, or you may want to think about your template actually being more granular. So things like, is my team just for internal use? If so, that makes your boundary and your data loss prevention and everything else locked down. If I'm going to use Teams for external collaboration, then at my Teams template boundary, I want to allow external users to be invited as guests into my team space. So we can start to think about the templating, and then we can start to think how we're going to provision those templates. which allows us to set our stall from an information governance perspective as we release those teams out into the wild. Yeah. So we've set our teams template can be used to identify the external sharing. It can be used to identify classification. So you can put official sensitive personal on an HR team, for example, that will have HR type records in it. You can have identify the longevity of that team. So if it's a project, you could put a 5-year then review life cycle on everything. You can assign accountability and ownership, which I'm going to come on to. I love assigning accountability. That is my favourite thing. Devolve the accountability. And if you use the template in your provisioning process, whether it's manual or through an automated process, you know then that every team that's created has that baseline level of governance wedded to it. Yeah. So that's how I would recommend that we start to think about applying our security and control and governance boundary at that team's level. Okay, I mentioned I love accountability. So just thinking about the blessings of accountability. As information governance professionals, we are responsible for lots of things, but we don't want to add to that. We are responsible for policies, processes, training, assurance, lots of other things might be in that list. But from this perspective, it's down to you as an individual and your manager and line manager to make sure that your role is actually defined in the Microsoft 365 space. That might sound really obvious, but believe me, mission creep is real. You need to make sure you understand what you are responsible for, what your IT colleagues are responsible for, what your information security colleagues are responsible for, if you're lucky enough to be in an organisation that has those specific roles. So really be clear about what policies, processes you are responsible for and what audit and assurance, because it can be really confusing. We've already seen the mocker slide, which shows how lots of people work. We've looked at the architecture with the different levels of admin. It needs to be really clear about who's doing what. But what we can also do is make sure that we assign accountability in an organisation, because it's a blessing for us so that actually people are responsible as well as accountable for their information and for using things in accordance with our policies, but also making sure that people are doing the right thing. Now, Slido, answer number 3, please, Elizabeth. We've got about accountability via teams, and we should have one about information asset owners and one about team site. 3 and 4 actually would be lovely.
Okay, so the information asset owners with team site responsibilities is no 39 and yes 27. And the other half of the question, do you have business representatives with accountability for specific teams through team site ownership? Yes is 35 and no is 28.
Okay, interesting. So there's it's almost half and half. I know it's not half and half, but it's very similar to that. So what we need to make sure that we're doing is thinking about our organisational accountability framework. So in the public sector, we still often have senior information risk owners. It's not compulsory anymore, but organisations have kept them. We've got information asset owners, normally, in a public sector organisation. And then we've got a level below them, so business process owners or deputy IAOs. And we need to make sure that we're assigning our accountability within the system so that people understand what they're accountable for, but also making sure that we can assure what they're doing on the sites as well. So we are monitoring what they're doing. We are not making sure that everybody is doing the right thing. We are making other people accountable for that. Now, from a team ownership perspective, what we can obviously do is give two people ownership of team sites. So they are governing, if you like, that Lego brick. They are responsible for the content, the people, anything that's being done within that team's application sort of site. And what we can also make sure is that we can devolve some responsibility for adding things like external guest membership, creating channels, There is a risk appetite question here from your organisational perspective. Some organisations will have a very low risk appetite if you're in things like policing or anything where you've got a lot of sensitive information. If you have a very high risk appetite in terms of you accept higher risk, then it's likely that your information is not very sensitive. You don't hold a lot of high classification information, and it's going to be a lot easier to sell this team's ownership and accountability delegation. But let's just think about how we're going to do this. Now, we've talked about teams being the Lego brick for our governance, but actually it's all about groups. Groups are for governance. Teams are for users and groups are for governance. If you create your teams using the Microsoft 365 group to underpin them, then you can very easily share the accountability and demonstrate where that accountability sits. So using the Microsoft 365 groups, you can manage who can access resources and services. So if you allocate the ownership of that group, as well as the team boundary and site, if you like, they can manage who's coming and going in the group. If you've got a way that the organisation is doing that through the Active Directory, you might not want to do that. But if you haven't, or your Active Directory isn't speaking to your joiners, movers, leavers process, then let's get the teams who are best placed to review that access to do that on a 6-monthly annual basis. So we can automate that. We can email them to say, check your access, check your guest access. Is it still appropriate? So that's the first thing we can do if we link the team's ownership with the group's ownership. We can also apply policies to groups, such as expiration. So when we think the group should expire, says it what it does on the tin. Naming, we can apply naming conventions. We can have blocked words, for example, as well, so we don't get horrific naming conventions on things. And you can still maintain the central provision of these things, but you're just giving the accountability and ownership away. To ensure that groups are consistent, relevant, and appropriate for your organisation, so you can still have that central governance. You can add or delete groups that are no longer needed, and that can again happen automatically. There's a way of setting up automated emails to group and teams owners to say, if this system hasn't been used within 6 months, and that means the team, the associated SharePoint site, any of the resources that are associated with that team, such as you might have a Teams notebook or a Teams planner, it will apply to all of that. So if any of that's been used within the period under review, then they won't get an expiry request to say that we want to delete your group and team. If none of that resource has been used, they will get an automated email to say, do you still need this capability? Automated. We just need to worry about if they don't answer. By the way, it doesn't default to deleting everything just before somebody in information governance panics. So we can make sure that we've got automated expiry on resources that don't seem to be being used. We can also monitor and audit the activity and usage through some of the administration centres to make sure we understand how that's being used and make sure that we are accountable for the assurance that people are using it in accordance with our policies. So we do still have a responsibility, of course, but it's an assurance, it's a top level responsibility, and the rest is divulged to the team owners and the group owners. And group owners can be associated or identified using your own internal accountability framework. So you can make it really applicable to how your organisation works. So just comment, I must mention the third part in this wheel, mustn't I? Which is SharePoint. SharePoint is for records and information. SharePoint is kind of the IG space, isn't it? I know there's lots of IG going on around all of this, but SharePoint is really the space where the records and information, traditional records management is going to happen if you've set your policy in the right way. Because if you haven't, you're going to have records all over the place. So if you haven't set the policy that if you're sharing anything in Teams or sharing anything in chat, it must be a link from a SharePoint site, or thou shalt get a knock on the door, then you're going to have content everywhere. So make sure that you're thinking about what your policy is in relation to, you want things being stored in SharePoint. If that's the way you want to go, that's your records repository. So thinking about the question we asked, question 1, we asked everybody about whether they were using the File tab in Teams as their SharePoint site or whether they'd created standalone. Luckily, most people are using the File tab because that actually allows you to do that triumvirate, I can't think of a better word, apologies, of groups, Teams and SharePoint. So if your group is being used for governance, it also can be used to govern the SharePoint site that's been generated as part of your team site as well. So those 3 things can all be governed together. Accountability to the group owners. So this allows us to make sure that we are collating all the information in one space. And I'm going to give you a sort of a real life scenario about how this might look. If you've set the templates for the team that the SharePoint's associated with, and you've set your accountability and your access management and everything else at group level, but because all 3 things are connected, you've effectively started the governance for your SharePoint site. You've got a business classification associated with it if you've set that. The one thing you probably need to think about is retention, because you might want to be a bit more granular in retention. You should try not to be. You should do it at that site level, but you might need to be a bit more granular, the exception rather than the rule, of course. But you might need to think about that in a bit more detail about how you're going to govern those files and content and folders within the SharePoint space specifically. But if you're doing all 3 together, you are simplifying your the complex scenario, if you like, of all the different governance that you need to think about. So let's just think quickly about a real life scenario. I haven't talked about how we're going to give just lost my thread. Haven't talked about yet how we're going to give the information asset owners accountability. And that's in the naming convention of the group and the team and the SharePoint site, because the 3 things are going to be connected. And that means we can actually identify who's ultimately accountable. Now, this can look a bit clunky, so we sometimes need to think about length of things. And it might be that you actually have this on the group name and you can present it differently in the sites. So there are different ways of doing this, but it still is all linked together and it still gives you that level of accountability. So for example, let's use a project scenario. So if I've got a Microsoft 365 project, then I want to think about who owns that project. Now, in this instance, it's the Chief Information Officer. Okay, so the CIO is on here as the information asset owner as part of the naming convention. Okay, so we've got M365 project. We've put the fact that it's a project template because that's going to confer a specific Teams template that I'm using, and it's going to tell me from a governance perspective, if I just need to look at that specific site, that it's a project template, which means I understand what the governance is at site level. Okay, and we can do things that are linked to that name through the group management and configuration and governance. So we've got the project itself, which is the M365 project. We've created the group. We've got the associated team, which is M365 project. We've got an associated SharePoint site, which has exactly the same name, but they're all linked back to this group. We've got the information asset owner identified. So if something goes really wrong, such as a breach, God forbid, or anything similar, then we know exactly who we need to go to for any rectification of issues or risks, or if people are being non-compliant and the business owners for the team itself aren't listening, we've got somewhere to escalate that to. We've got 2 owners of our group and our team and our SharePoint site. We've got the project manager and the project support officer, and they are able to, because it's a project site, they're allowed to give guest access to that site. They're able to create channels. And in this instance, it would be shared channels or private channels as well. because we're all going to be governing that within this boundary, if you like. So because it's a project with external support from consultants, I've used a template, which is an external project template in Teams. In the Teams admin center, I've created that. And what that gives me is an official classification, unless anybody creates a private channel where they can differentiate from that. It's got a retention of 5 years, and then it needs to be reviewed, and the review will be automatic through the mechanisms that I've talked about earlier. And we have got the ability to add external members. It's not just locked down to internal membership. So everything is governed at that site level. I've got overarching accountability with the information asset owner, and I've got 2 business owners who are responsible for the day-to-day, which I can then assure from an information governance perspective, and IT and information security can do the same, so that to make sure that people are working in line with current policy, the policy that we set before we communicated about all the changes with the templates. Yeah, so there's an order of things. So just to recap, this slide just gives you some of the decision points that you've got in relation to governing teams. But what I have done is I have handily linked you to the, I have somewhere, in my notes, I have got a link to the Microsoft 365 resources in Microsoft Learn, which goes into each of these capabilities in a little bit more detail. So I'll make sure that they're provided to you in the chat once I stop speaking. I will cut and paste those in. So I've got a little link which tells you in more detail how you physically do this within the system using the admin centers. Okay. So I'm going to be honest, been keeping my eye on the chat, but what I'm going to do is go to any questions. Before I have a little peep in the chat, I just want to say that also on the slides, there'll be feedback. There'll also be a little advert for the Leadership Through Data Microsoft Teams course, which is coming up in December, which goes into a lot more detail about how you do these things. And there's some other information about quarterly catch-ups and training courses. Okay.
So there is one question from Mark Smith in the chat for you, Rachel.
I will have a look.
It's the last entry in the chat.
Okay. I note the final element in your naming convention is a code for the role title of information asset owner. Would a viable alternative be to use the registered and hopefully stable number of the information asset? Yeah, do you know what? It depends how your organisation manages information assets, and then how they split those under the information asset owners. So from our perspective, the example that I do in my day job, if you like, we use a 3-letter acronym for the information asset owner so that they can recognise which ones they're responsible for as well. So we'll send them a little report which has got their acronym on the end, which shows them the list of things they're accountable for. So that just makes it a bit more friendly with the people that are accountable, rather than using an information asset number. And we have information asset owners that are responsible for many information assets. So that wouldn't quite work, but it ultimately depends on how best you want to assign that accountability. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Mark. So you can just do whatever your governance, so what your governance and policy lends itself to, just lift and shift that into the system and do it that way around. Our decisions and policies should inform how we configure the system itself. I can see some interesting ones about Yammer. Yammer's a conflicting one for information governance peeps. I hated it when I first got into Microsoft 365 and I saw that there was this Yammer thing. I was like, why would I want another communications channel? But I'm actually a bit won over by it. But it does depend on your organisation. And there are issues. I don't work for Microsoft. I've seen Stephen's comment. I'm not affiliated to Microsoft in any way, shape or form. It isn't fantastic, but the problem is most organisations in the public sector are adopting it. So we've got to find the best way to work with it. And IRMS have done some amazing things to try and get us in the right space. I think that's it from questions. If anybody would like to get in touch with me directly, if you're looking at the recording, I am quite happy to take any questions directly through my email, which I can also pop. I don't know what the best way is to share some of the links and my email address, Elizabeth. Is it best just to pop it in the chat?
The problem is if you pop it in the chat, as soon as we end the meeting, it will be lost.
Okay.
So probably the easiest thing for you to do is if you could email me all the links, and I will circulate it via the IRMS website with the slides when the time once we have everything to do that, because I think if people haven't got any questions, we will bring the meeting to a close in a moment. So if you wanted to pop stuff in the chat now, then obviously people will only have a few minutes, but that's absolutely fine if people are happy with that.
There's just a couple. I can see a question from Carol about what was it about Yammer that won me round. Do you know what it was? It was about the fact that some people preferred that mechanism for communication over the traditional things like we had. So from an information governance perspective, obviously we've got an intranet page that I use, and we have like a weekly update that is shared with people now, thank goodness, rather than emailed, but people didn't read it. So we've got an Ignite page on Yammer. I didn't think I'd pinched it from Microsoft, but it might have been a subconscious thing. Don't tell them. We've got an Ignite page on Yammer, which basically any sort of new policies or top tips we find, we ignite them on Microsoft Engage, as it's called now. And we find a lot more people interact with it than they would if it was in the weekly kind of Teams update that people didn't seem to read. So it's purely about different channels for different demographics, I think, as well, and different methodology of communication. That link's not a link. I appreciate that. I'm going to just copy the link. So thank you for your time today, everybody. I hope you found some of it useful, even if a lot of it might have been not new to those who are a bit longer on your journey. Nice to meet you if I haven't met you before. I'm on LinkedIn as well, so I'm always happy to have a chat about the best way of doing things, because I don't like reinventing the wheel. Thanks a lot, guys.
So thank you very much, Rachel, for taking the time to share your expertise with us. As a group, we really appreciate the willingness of our speakers to share their time and energy and expertise. So I will say that I hope everyone has enjoyed the session. The next session is on the 16th of November, and I've already sent out the link for that. So if I will just pop that in the chat now for the 2 minutes if you've not seen it, and it just leaves me to say thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you have a pleasant afternoon, and we will look forward to seeing those of you who are able to be with us on the 16th of November. Thank you.